I'm Dean Newland, and welcome to Leadovation. Reimagine, facilitate, flourish. This podcast is dedicated to the art and science of innovative leadership. Through insightful interviews with industry experts, I bring you cutting-edge strategies and experiences of innovative leadership, helping you think differently, act strategically, and achieve remarkable results. Join me as I provide insights and tools that empower you to make smarter decisions, forge meaningful relationships. Welcome to Leadovation. You know, every once in a while, I run into a person who plays life full on, who really takes a big bite and who's about really going after desires and purpose with great vigor and intensity. A person who is so much about going all in that others sort of stand back and go, wow, how are they able to do all this? How are they able to be so courageous? And how are they able to get so much accomplished? And I think these people are a bit of a mystery to a lot of us because on one hand, we admire them, we might even fear them, and we are also confused by them because we don't know how to do what they do. And yet the next guest on this podcast is, in fact, a person who lives like that. And while his story is about playing in the area of building businesses and scaling them and going through IPO process and getting public funding, the real story for this individual is about how he goes all in, about how he plays big, about how he has a process by which to do that, and how he has been able to have others come to him and ask him, how did you do this? And what does that process look like? And I found myself just having a phenomenal conversation with him as we talked about things like relationships that may not always stick around, about the consequences of playing big, about questions you can ask yourself before you go into a new project or a new business or a new relationship for that matter, to really understand where you are aligned or not aligned with not only the vision, but the consequences of what you're trying to accomplish. It's about following one's purpose, and it's about being confident in yourself and not hesitant to move forward with boldness and conviction, and realizing that these big bites that you're taking out of life, you are not doing it alone. You are doing it with other people. And maybe, in fact, by so doing that, you are realizing that you're not alone and that you can take big bites out of life and do it with others. His name is Rick Jordan, and Rick is really the definition of a self-made person. And you hear about his background growing up as a young lad, you understand what I'm talking about, and he'll talk about that in our interview. He forged his success by going all in, as he says, not only in business but in life. And he's built a public company without external financial help, all while funding and building a family. He is the host of a podcast also called All In with Rick Jordan, and he is one heck of a keynote speaker. He's very influential as a media personality, and he certainly has this sidebar interest as being an interesting guy who loves fine scotch. Phenomenal conversation. I think you'll enjoy it. Mr. Rick Jordan on the Leadovation podcast. Rick, it's great having you on the show all the way from Chicago. Is that right?
That's right. What's
Chicago, Illinois, big windy city. Yeah, I'm glad to have you on the show. I mean, before we actually hit the record button, we were talking about this theme around that if you're going to play, if you're going to go for it, if you're going to go play big, you're going to have to be ready to take the big hits. And when you said that to me, man, my brain just went into lightning overdrive, because I think that on one hand, I've been around some pretty big players who are playing it really big, and I've been watching them from a sideline going, wow, look at the kind of challenge they run into, the pushback that they get from people. And it's horrendous. And yet, if you're going to play at that level, you're going to have to be ready for equal amount of adversity at times. And I think that some people probably don't go for the big play, don't really stick their neck out because they're afraid of what could happen.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
tell me more about what that means to you in your own personal life to kind of get us to know who you are. And then also, how do you coach people to one, play big and to also to be resilient to some of the pushback that you get?
Yeah, both of those are phenomenal questions, man. Because the short backstory is the company I founded almost 15 years ago, Reach Out Technology. I took public about 9 months ago, and first everyone feels, I know, because you see movies, right, and you see like, oh, it's the big IPO, it's the ringing of the bell, and all that, and that's not typically the case how this happens. I was comforted by an article in the journal that I saw that it was around average of about 10 years that a company from founding to actually going public, that's kind of the average. It's not, you get a bunch of funding in Silicon Valley as a tech firm, or Austin, Texas now, more so in 2024, and then all of a sudden you're ringing the bell at NASDAQ or NYSE or something else. It's a process, especially going from a one-man shop where I started
Hmm.
into an 8-figure company that's now a public company. And it's through these 9 months, this process called the reverse merger was supposed to take 60 days. And that's when we found out a whole bunch of things. I mean, just a perfect storm, right? I'll I'll get slightly in the weeds, but not too deep because I don't want to get technical. It's just we found out that the fiscal year, which we knew going into it, was 10/31 for the public vehicle we chose to reverse into, and our fiscal year was 12/31.
Hmm.
And after 10/31, we acquired the business, if you want to put it that way, or reverse merged into it on November 13th ish, which now meant we were responsible for that audit for the previous year.
Hmm.
So that was audit number one. Then when you take a private company and reverse into an existing public shell, you look at, or they call vehicles, right? Shell's a dirty word, but we'll call it a vehicle. Now you have to bring the existing financials that you have as a private company to a point to where they are compliant with the public vehicle. So that was audit number 2 for years 21 and 22. And then
Hmm.
the third audit, which we're in right now, is that transitional period, which is 23 for the private company and those 2 months to make everything align with the fiscal year. And all through this process, one of the big auditors, I guess there was 4 of them in May, got shut down by the SEC for a whole bunch of nasty stuff, which means that it hit the entire public audit industry,
Wow.
almost like a tornado, man. Stuff that we could have never predicted, which slowed down this process even more. So here we are, 9 months later, rolling into the 10th month, and we've had our funding that's been committed to us because we filed an S1 from a financial sponsor. The whole reason for going public, no joke, is to generate more capital, to continue to build your business. Access to public capital is such more of a greater resource than private capital is, especially at the stage my company is at. So going into that, it was now our funding has been delayed something around 8 months
Oh.
because of this process.
Oh no.
So it's like you buckle
Yeah.
down on sales, man, and in the process, we also we closed on an acquisition about 35 days before we went public, and we closed on another one in April. So now we've had to roll those in too, those financials, which of course extended this process and
Yeah.
going through integrations and everything else. So it's been challenging to say the
Well,
least.
I think that you were describing something that probably some won't quite understand, but I do think a lot of people understand is this volatility that a lot of us are going through,
Yeah.
especially this particular year. Now, so you and I were talking, end of August 2024.
Yep.
We're in an election year. One could say that we are in a period of history that is extremely disruptive. And if I've mentioned this on other episodes, and if you listen to and follow the work of people who wrote a book called The Fourth Turning, we are in a period of time of great disruption that happens every 80 to 100 years. And so, yeah, you will come out of it, but this is difficult times. This is
It
difficult
is.
times for a
It
lot
is.
of people, whether you're waiting tables or whether you're trying to merge your company or what have you. There's a lot of disruption, a lot of unknowns. So how have you been able to sort of, I think that ourselves are the great sort of the repository or the great petri dish that we use to be able to teach other people. So,
Yeah.
what have
Yeah.
you learned about yourself during this rather difficult time, and how are you being able to translate that into a teaching moment for other people? So, I guess those are two questions.
Yep, great questions. Also, the resilience I think you mentioned earlier is part of the second half of your first question. And I always knew that I was resilient. I mean, it takes back to my story with my when my dad passed when I was 16. That was really kind of the first test of anything that I had, with my brother and sister being 5 and 6 years younger than me. My mom making $7 an hour. I was raising my brother and sister for 2 years.
Hmm.
So all the way fast forward to today, it was. I already knew that I was resilient, but I don't believe that anyone really knows the limits, or rather, I should phrase it as the inverse of that, the the great extent that you actually can push yourself to until you place yourself in a situation that requires it. Now, obviously, my dad passing away is not something that a situation that I actively put myself into. But founding a company 15 years ago, going through everything that I did with that, but launching a personal brand and now taking the company public, those were all choices, man. So I threw myself into this, and I've always had this idea where I don't believe that you should put things behind you to push you into things. I think you should put things out into the future to pull you into those moments and pull you into those things.
Hmm. So
So when
all
you
that being said, then Rick, when you mention your father and you mention almost being a surrogate father to
Yeah,
your siblings, a sense with that 5 year difference. Um, I don't know who was it, Brian Tracy or one of the old thought leaders of years ago said that we're all trying to prove something. If
always.
you
Yeah.
believe that idea, not to sound so, crass, but what are you trying to prove? Why do you put yourself into these situations? Or another way of saying, what's your purpose behind all this?
Yeah, I was challenged one time by one of my original board members that when we face a problem, he would always say, "Hey, Rick, I think you're thinking too small."
Hmm.
Yeah, and whenever you face a problem, so some others might describe it, we could come up with thought leaders all day long to like, "Hey, zoom out so you can see things from a bigger vantage point." It's the same thing. But then, I mean, there's a book that I read just about a month ago. It's been out for a couple of years, but it's the subtle art of not giving a fuck. And one of the biggest concepts in that is you're always going to have problems, but you want to trade your problems for better problems. And for me, trading my problems now in line with all of those other concepts is like trading your problems for bigger problems,
Hmm.
because bigger problems for me always means bigger opportunity. So when I throw that out in the future, like I was saying, it can pull me into that scenario. So if I look at something, and I was looking at shifts in my industry, and it's like there's consolidation, I think the only way to survive, unless I want to look at something different, maybe selling myself, like selling my company itself, would be to go big, because that's the nature of where this marketplace is going. At least cybersecurity for small businesses,
Hmm.
because the one and two man shops, man, they're dying because they don't have the skill sets. And secondly, they don't have the financial resources to access the right tool sets. From software and even people, it costs more to hire people with the right skill sets, and it costs more to buy the software to get you the right tool sets to do this job now. So I'm looking at this. I'm like, the only way to go is if I want to do this. But I'm like, what can I do for myself, but even more so for other people? And it's like, so if it's I'm putting out pillars, or right, like the three pillars. Think about a triangle. I like triangles, by the way. I don't know
I
why. I
noticed
just do.
that.
Yeah. So if it's three pillars, man, it's cybersecurity for all, bringing wealth to everybody involved, and raising the bar in the industry. Because it's
Hmm.
so fragmented, right? If I go in reverse, but then wealth for all is like public markets do that. It's like, wouldn't it be cool to provide this space for everybody? Because it's way beyond me. Of course, I get wealthy in the meantime. Let's be real about this, because it's just how this goes. But that's okay. It's like this water cup that I have, man, right? I've always said this before too, because people are like, oh, you got to worry about filling your own cup. Don't empty out so much to where you're constantly giving to other people, but you got nothing left in here. And I look at it a different approach, similar to like the inverse we're talking about. Keep the filling going so that there's overflow, and around you gets to bless everybody else that you choose to surround yourself with, and those that actually choose to be around you. So you're constantly trying to stay full. The only way I can stay full, man, that I see is like, okay, what amazing new chaotic problematic thing do I see out there that I can help solve?
You have a nice triangle with your business. I love it. Do you have something similar by how you live your life or how you coach others to live theirs? Because I think in some ways there's a desire
It's
on the
always
human
threes.
level
Yeah.
is
Yeah. Even,
around like how does this world
yep.
work? I mean, how do we survive? How do we thrive in this environment? I mean, it's the age old question. My very first workshop when I was much younger was all about life purpose. It's a
Yeah.
similar sort of theme, but I guess my question from you is, what is your secret sauce that seems to be what you're trying to figure out yourself, and
Yeah.
at the same time you're trying to teach other people to do?
Yeah, it's crazy because I do have a lot of triads in existence. When it comes to business and when it comes to decision making, I always talk about calm, confidence, and never hesitate.
Hmm.
Those are three that I live by too, because even with things facing you, like, how we talked about just prior to the show, if you want to play the big game, you got to be ready to take the big hits because there's a lot of things that you won't expect, but it'll show those things. One of the only ways to get through those, it's like, all right, everything else that I've gotten through before, I've been able to handle it, which means everything else that's coming up against me, I'll be able to handle it as long as I'm calm, confident, and I don't hesitate.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I believe, I mean, this can come down to, dude, saying, am I going to go ask that cute girl out? You know, in addition to business decisions, or it could be like, do I want to have a kid right now with my spouse or my partner? So it's like calm, confident, never hesitate. Even that went back to, when finally it was a time to have kids, and my wife and I were talking, and she was getting upset because it was 6 years into the marriage, and she's like, I want kids, I want kids. I'm like, I don't have all my ducks in a row, and it was like, this was when I kind of learned that lesson. And finally, when I let it go, I'm like, whatever, dude, chill, because this is who you are. You're calm, you're confident, and you don't hesitate. And then
It,
it's like the universe chose to reward me with twins.
oh, no
So,
kidding.
yes, no kidding. Who are 17 now. So it's that
Wow.
it's pretty awesome because the best things come out when you stick to that triad. And one when it comes to parenting or relationships, it's always love, resilience, and understanding. So
Hmm.
these triads kind of exist. So when I'm coaching, it's a lot of that too. So, I mean, some might ask, it's like, what's your gut feeling about this? And some people will say, it's like, I don't know. I'm so confused and everything. I'm like, well, if you detach yourself, if you lift yourself up, how can you be calm right now? What would make this situation calm for you? How would you be confident in this? And then what would you do if you had unlimited resources right now and you could, because that's typically, you don't hesitate, right? If you think you've got
Hmm.
everything that you need, you don't hesitate in making a decision.
Yeah.
I think hesitation and procrastination comes from obviously perfectionism, but perfectionism is just more so saying, I don't think I have everything I need yet, or like what I was saying, I didn't think I had all my ducks in a row.
But isn't that also sort of a cousin to the notion of need for security or
Yeah,
the avoidance of fear? My wife and I have talked about this a lot. We have what we call these tub talks. We sit out in the hot tub, or we sit outside in the backyard, and
I
we
like that.
crank up the fire, and we
Yeah,
we have these long chats. And sometimes they're quite philosophical, spiritual, religious, and everything under the sun. But we kind of even like said, what are we here to do? What is our
yeah,
marriage to do as a couple? Not just for ourselves and our family, but why are we here together? Of all the other people we could have met, why did we come together?
yeah,
Part of the conversation seems to be coming back to this idea of helping others navigate past fear into hope, fear into being bold, fear into being directive in your life, fearing to beyond fear into living your highest and best as whatever that is defined by you. And that maybe with some little bit of grace and some insights, we can help people through that. And of course, that means the same thing for us, right? We have to then face that as well and play big. And,
yeah, yeah.
and, um, and at the same time, I'm also why this for us seems to be useful is because we see it all over the place, a lot of hesitation, a lot of apathy. When you think of,
Yeah.
yeah, you can point to the pandemic, you can point to AI, you can point to the job market, you can point to political divisiveness, you can point to a lot of different things, but there is something about the human condition that holds itself back. Maybe out of something having to do with this thing called fear. And I think that it is my personal duty, our duty is to find ways to move past that.
I love
What
that.
about you? What do you think?
Yeah. I've talked about fear here and there, and because I've had to relate it to things in my life too, of course. And I completely believe that fear is only something that exists for us in the present. You know, because typically speaking, and I don't know what you find. Maybe you can relate to this when you're
Mm.
coaching or self-examining, you know, or having the tub talks as you're talking about. Which I need to try that. That sounds awesome. I might
That's
have a
yeah, it's
cigar
not
and a
bad. Try that
scotch,
out.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
along
I
with it.
saw that you are a Scotch connoisseur, so maybe
Yeah,
that's a conversation for later.
for sure. Uh, the fear aspect is like the past already happened, so it's impossible to be afraid. So when I hear individuals and I'm coaching them, it's a well, I'm afraid that this is going to happen again. And it's like, well, it did happen. You know, could it happen again? Maybe, but what were your learnings from that? Because you're
Yeah.
basing yourself around something that already is over and done. And I hope you learned something from it. You know, just like this 10-month long process. You know, going public. Man, I could like chalk up 47 different things that I learned during this entire process, so that I don't have to go through it again. It's not going to keep me from taking another company public potentially if the opportunity comes around. You know, but then you look out, it's like, oh, what if this? What if that? And you know, that that fear of the future, which really is more anxiety based, you know, but they'll say that I'm scared of this happening, you know, and a lot of times that doesn't necessarily have much of a foundation in something because their mind likes to play things, play tricks on us. It's like, well, you're not there yet. So it's like, let's just focus on right here, you know, and it comes back to the calm, confident, and never hesitate. So I always try to bring people back to right now. It's like, what is it today? What is the thing that you can do right now? Because you see
Hmm.
something that you want, you know, and fear is something, dude, fear is something that's actually ingrained in us and meant to be an ally, you know, because it's meant to warn us of certain things. However, if you're being emotional about this entire thing and you could potentially just for a moment emotionally detach and lean on those things, it's like I went through this before. First off, sure, could these things happen again? Maybe. You know, it's possible. I'm not going to say probable, but it's possible. Well, so what happened before? Then you can lean on that past and be like, well, I made it through that time. You know, it might
Hmm.
have been some pain for a while, but I'm still here. I'm still alive. I still got something out of it.
Yeah.
So right
Yeah.
now is always the point of decision. When I see that people are scared, I think it's flip-flopped. I don't think that it's fear keeping them stuck. I think that they've actively chosen or subconsciously chosen, they might not realize it, to go a different way in the road, go down a different fork in the road. I just came to this epiphany like 2 weeks ago, man, is that people are like, I'm stuck, I'm stuck, I'm stuck. And then I woke up one day, I'm like, I don't think anybody's really stuck because time continues to move forward. So whatever you're doing right now, you are choosing a certain path, whether you think
But
you're actively choosing it or not, because it's just like a current of river, you know, a current in a river is you can go certain directions, but you can choose, and that current's going to pull you along or push you along regardless of how scared you are, or regardless of indecision, or regardless of procrastination. Everything else around you continues to move forward, which means that you're also moving forward.
100%. Well, maybe it's a semantic discussion here, but when I
Absolutely, it
think
is.
about
It's
people
framing.
talk
Yeah.
exactly, when you talk about
Yep.
being stuck, I sometimes think about a mindset that is, or an avoidance,
Yeah.
you know, to face something or to accept something or to forgive something, and therefore we're sort of stuck in a thought pattern that may not be congruent with the change that's happening along the way. To
Yeah.
your point about the river and so forth.
It's a loop of
Um,
decision making, right? And
yeah,
rather than being stuck, it's like, oh, wait, I'm not really. I've just made the same decision 112 times.
very good point. Very good point. I've reiterated the same decision over and over again, day in
Yeah.
and day out. There's something about your your reference towards fear that made me think about kind of got me into thinking about intuition, which was what this podcast at one point was really focused on.
Oh, cool.
But it's also this idea that when I or others, I think sometimes are sort of feeling held back by a self-imposed fear that may not be beneficial for moving forward. I get
Yeah.
your point that fear is actually a tool, but when it's a barrier, that there is a mindset that somehow is attached to that fear that says, I have to do it alone, or I am alone, or I don't have resources. Much like with your company, you know, you're working through public support, you know, through this transition. You know, now all of a sudden you have access to all sorts of different support. And I think that sometimes we get into this pattern around fear because we think, no, I'm alone. I have nothing else. It's up to me to make this
Yeah.
happen,
Yeah.
and therefore, if I play it big and I want to make a big splash,
Yeah.
then the challenge comes back all onto me, right? And so I think that the mindset that gets in our way is that sort of calculus doesn't equate, so we get overwhelmed. But if we realize we're part of a much larger collective tribe family,
Oh, right on.
bring
Yeah.
in, go into your
Yeah.
spiritual religious background. I know that you're a man of faith, right? You bring into those sort of higher principles, you can realize I am not alone. I do have help. And all of a
Always.
sudden, these big, hairy, audacious goals that we're going after are not necessarily as difficult because we have a tribe of people that are helping us through that.
That's so important, man. I love how you're hitting that because you can tend to feel alone.
Yes.
And isolationism is really kind of a strategy. And I think fear would come first, but then after fear, it becomes, well, I'm just going to remove myself, which is also a choice, right? It's a decision to make. I'm
Yeah.
just going to remove myself from other people around me. And I think the way to get out of that is to ask for help. If
Yeah.
you can bring yourself to be like, who am I going to ask? Everybody can always think of somebody, even if it's just a therapist, even if you don't want to ask somebody that if you think, well, my parents are gone. I don't have any grandparents. I don't have any siblings. I don't have any friends. I mean, these are all fallacies, of course, for the most part. It's like, well, then who do I have to help me? It's like, well, there's people out there. You just have to go looking for it.
Yeah.
And you were talking about some of the things about the intuition side, and there's two questions as well that I love. And I think I read this somewhere. I'm not going to coin this and say that this was mine, but to get out of this mode, this fear mode, the first question is, what would it mean if I were wrong?
Hmm.
It's actually it's actually fairly easy for people to think that it's possible for them to be wrong. But what I've seen is that it's very difficult for most people to actually go one step deeper and say, what would that mean if I were wrong? So you can sit there and like, I'm thinking this thing. It's like, well, is it possible that I'm wrong? Sure. But then that's where the thought process stops. And then you continue to make those decisions over and over again. But then going that one level deeper and saying, what would it actually mean if I were wrong? And then there's one follow-up question to that is, would that create something better or worse for myself and the ones around me if I was wrong?
Give me an example. I like where you're going, and I'm
Yeah,
thinking about people listening to this to bring it into a tangible example.
yeah, for sure. I'll take a look at kind of where we started with this whole process, right? With
Yeah.
with taking the company public, because you think about this in years past, and this was the calm, confident, never hesitate thing. It was brought to me. It wasn't my idea to take my company public. It was brought to me from a consultant. They saw a photo of an event where I spoke in the Nasdaq boardroom in Times Square. It was on the jumbotron. It was an entrepreneurial event that you paid to be at to speak, like a lot of sponsorships that you would do. And they found that photo of me somewhere on the internet and approached me. They're like, we think you would be a great spokesperson. What would you do if you had the capital after going public? And I already had the plan. I said, that's easy. I take a lot of little companies. It's a roll up, make a lot of big companies. The thought process is here. I've already looked at the industry. I was like, wow, you seem to have this ready to go. So they said, we've talked with two other business owners, and the other ones are like, oh, I'd put it into marketing or sales, but they had no real plan,
Mm.
or even more so, they had no real destination. So when I was calm, confident, didn't hesitate, we're like, "Do you want to do this?" I'm like, "Yeah, I want to do this. Let's go." So if I take a look back, and I had that thought process, like, if this is the next step, what would it mean if I were wrong? If this wasn't the next step, if this wasn't the way to go, it means that the company could implode. Because I know it's going to take a lot of effort to get there. It could mean that my livelihood might be gone. So I'm looking at all the negatives of what would it mean if I were wrong, because in that spot, I was thinking, "Hey, this is the way to go. I think I'm right." Different scenario. You know, so I didn't really have my fears, but then I'm challenging myself and my intuition. It's like, what would it mean if I were wrong? Then it's like, would that create a better or worse situation for me, for for myself and for those around me if I was wrong? And I'm like, well, it sure would prove the resilience and the loyalty of those that are around me. That's
True.
one of the things that I thought, and I've found out through the last, especially 10 months, that it's been a painful yet necessary purge of people and just superfluous things that I don't need at this point in my life. Because going through the hard
Hmm.
things, and when you say that when we go back to saying that it's the big, you play the big game, you got to be ready to take the big hits. It's like there are individuals that I thought, man, you're awesome. I'm talking employees there, right? Man, you're awesome. This is crazy. And then all of a sudden they'll just walk out on a day because they get emotional. It just gets too difficult for them, going through this
Right.
process. There's others, and I've learned this from acquisitions, like I'm buying your company as part of this process, but then they'll have seller's remorse and then they'll go rogue. Because how much did they actually believe in the vision? Or if you want to get personal on something like this, and this is something that I've experienced too, going back to this whole thing, because part of the process of going public, I kid you not, people don't invest in the company, they invest in the founders and the management. You could be, this is how companies with no revenue, while we had revenue, a few $1 million in revenue, companies with no revenue will raise millions of dollars to get going as a startup. You think that they're actually believing in the company when they don't even have a proof of concept yet, the investors?
Hmm.
No, they're believing in the people in the management, the founder and the management. That's the same thing here. So then you start to be able to figure out, it's like, well, what would it mean for those around me? But when I built the personal brand, and started doing these things like NASDAQ and all those other things, like some of the biggest naysayers that I had were the ones that I thought were the closest to me my entire life.
So I follow through with me on the logic of your two questions.
Yeah.
And I like them, but I just want to kind of put it into, I don't know, bring it home for me, because the way you describe this, you said, well, what would go wrong? What would be the result if my
Yeah. Would
assumptions
it
were
create
wrong,
something
right?
better or worse for myself and those around me?
Right. So you just sort of described some stuff, like, for example, I could lose my livelihood.
Yeah.
The companies could go under. One might go, well, that doesn't sound so good.
I know.
One might say, I'm not necessarily aligned to that possibility. So I guess my question is, what is the purpose of the questions? If what it is, it to help
Yeah.
you analyze your thinking, and it gives you a better preparation for moving through the decision? Is it to help you make a different decision based on the answers of those two questions? Tie that
Y-
back.
Yeah. It's an inner look. If you look at this from the inverse, it's a good way. And I see where you're going with your question too, because in my situation, I didn't hesitate. It's like, okay, this is the next step. But for somebody who might have an opportunity come across and they'll be like, oh no, I'm not going to do that because I've never done that before. Like if I look at me,
Mm,
right? If I was insecure in this, it's like I've never taken a company public before. I've never raised capital. I've never had a multi-million-dollar organization. I've never had 100 employees. There's no way I can do that. It's going to implode on me. I don't know how to do that. It's going to crash down. It's going to kill my livelihood. It's going to destroy the loyalty of my family and friends that are around me. And then it's asking the question, well, what if I were wrong? What would it mean if I were wrong? Maybe that could mean opportunity for
mm,
everybody else that's around me. More
I see.
opportunity for everybody else that's around me. Maybe that could mean, it could create a better situation for everybody around me. So it's more the inverse for me, because I tend to just throw those things ahead of me to pull me into them. It's a different scenario. But typically it's more like I'm thinking that the negative is going to happen.
Yeah.
And when you start to ask these two questions, you can start to move to the point to where I've been for the last several years of my life, probably 9, 10 years, is just like, I'm just going to talk about what all the good could potentially happen in this. And then I'll challenge myself to make sure that I'm okay with the risks, which if you wanted to look at that for a third question, that would probably be the third
Mm,
question for somebody who's thinking the positive direction first, like I tend to do,
yeah.
is, what would it mean if I were wrong? It's like, am I okay with that? Yeah, I'm okay with that.
I had somebody on this show once. I forget who it was. I wish I could recall his name, but he said something about the solution is in the doubt.
Oh, I like that.
Thought that was very provocative.
Yeah.
And it also kind of reminds me of another, oh gosh, Gary Klein. wrote a bunch of books on decision making. He worked for the U.S. military
Yeah.
and helped them with their decision making processes and so forth. And he had developed a process called a pre-mortem versus
Hmm.
our standard sort of project
Oh,
management after action review, aka post-mortem, bringing into a healthcare analogy.
yeah.
And his point was, let's get everybody in the room and talk about, all right, let's imagine 5, 10 years out, and this particular project business, put whatever the context is, absolutely fails.
Yeah.
Let's just assume that it fails. Why did it fail? And then let's talk about that. Let's get all of these particular doubts out on the table, because of course we have a culture that you have to be a team player, and team
Hmm.
players don't talk about their doubts. Team players are always, the cup is half full versus half empty. And
Yeah.
we're going to shun you if it turns out that you start sharing your doubts, because that must mean that you're really not committed, right? So it turns that upside
I love
down
this. Yeah.
and allows people to go like, yeah, I'm concerned about our leadership. I'm concerned about, we've got scope creep. I'm concerned about, we don't have funding. We don't have enough technology. And then we start to assess afterwards how many of those particular doubts have merit, how many of them we can say, thanks for sharing, really appreciate it. I don't
Yeah.
think that it's a serious one, but I just, I don't know, somehow I remembered that quote based on some of the things you just talked about,
I
is to
like that
really analyze
approach.
some of that. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's really good.
I'm starting
That's
to
cool.
notice too, as we've gotten bigger, as a company, and you start to make bigger decisions, things that might potentially cost multiple millions of dollars. I think an approach like that would be very, very valuable because it's
Absolutely. Yeah.
when you're smaller and you're making these choices, you can adjust, and I've heard people
Yes.
start to make analogies like it's a speedboat versus the Titanic. It's like the Titanic, you need more time to plan that route than you do because of the potential dangers that could be out there, whereas a speedboat can obviously adjust and change course pretty quickly.
There's one other thing, Rick, that you said that really kind of caught my attention. So I'm going to pivot back to something you said, and I
Yeah,
want to ask you more about it. You said something about going big has, for you at least, brought into clarity that some of the people, my words, not yours, that were most close to you were the ones that bailed on you.
yeah,
I may be describing this not correctly, but I've noticed that too. That some of the most cherished relationships I've had have not stuck along,
yeah,
and they've been painful to end, but realize it was the right thing to do. I've seen other leaders going after some very big goals who, in the process, have had to part ways with some very, very important members of their team whom you would never think would ever happen.
yeah.
So, talk a little bit more about that. And it's not to scare people into thinking, oh, no, I can't play big because I'm going to lose my key relationships. But I think it's part of that resilience piece that
Yeah,
our
yeah,
paths are going to splinter into different directions, and I'd much rather have a potent, committed relationship that is really about changing something versus something that's apathetic and we don't really care much about what this relationship's about because we got too flabby in our commitment to each other. But anyway,
yeah.
I'm pontificating a bit, but what do you think about all this?
I think there's a big misconception around relationships, whether it's professional, business, personal, friendships, romance, all of that everything is the same, so if you and I've learned this the hard way, even with a best friend that I grew up with, who ended up working for me for probably about a year and a half or so. And I had not been that close with him for about 10 years just because he was doing his life, I was doing mine. We got back together. He came and worked for me, and I started realizing it's like my friendship with him was phenomenal back when I was in my teens and early 20s. Like one of the best friends you could ever have, and it's like this is lifelong. And then I recognize it's like, but wait, it's not, because when I started going through this time period with him, like he's still the same guy.
Hmm.
And when I'm saying that, he's still holding on to beliefs that he had 20 years ago. And I'm thinking today, it's like, but wait, I've progressed forward in life. And while there's things that's like, sure, he's married, got kids, and everything else, has had his own jobs and everything. It's like at the same time, the ideals, because I know that I've put a lot of work into myself to grow emotionally, professionally, spiritually, to where I've challenged, and a lot of the same beliefs that I had 20 years ago just don't exist today.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because, and that's a thing of ego, I believe, is it's a thing of ego, because when you're so set in what you believe, now there's some things, yes, stand on them. There are hills to die on when it comes to your own personal values, and specific beliefs, at the same time, be ready to challenge those things, because it comes back to like, what would it mean if I were wrong? And that's
Mm.
killing the ego in that process, to where I saw it's like, man, it's like you're locked in. It's like, dude, I am not who I was 20 years ago. And I want to see you move to a point to where you're not there. So, I mean, even if you look at romantic relationships, right? Whether you're married or not, life partners, whatever, it's like, I hope the conversation comes up in that relationship for you, Dean, for everybody who's listening and watching us, to where somebody says, you're not the same person that I married.
Thank
Good.
God.
Yeah.
That's what. Yeah,
Good.
exactly.
Yes. Or, I wish this company was how it was years ago. It's like, cool, you need to go.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Right.
It's and that's all ego, because it's so based on you, to where you're thinking that I mean, it's quite literally that the entire world revolves around you. Because if you're thinking that
Yeah.
I'm just going to stay in this spot right here because this is what I believe and this is how I feel it's supposed to be, I'm comfortable right here.
Yeah.
But then
There's
you get
that.
pissed at everybody else, and this is where those individuals fall away, because they project their anger at you, being like, well, wait a second, you just did this and that's pretty cool, but here I am.
It's so true, man. You just hit it. This is great. I'm thinking about like sacred cows in
Yes.
companies, people
Yeah.
who have been around for a long time, or a member of your team that is not performing well. And we go, why are you not holding them accountable? And well, whatever, or they're a founder's son or daughter,
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
sort of really nepotism type situations that add a whole nother layer of loyalty, because now you have family in there. So, and I was told this, people said, if you can never, ever, worst case scenario, let somebody go, fire them,
Yeah.
then you're always going to be stuck in being committed to mediocrity. You have a pathway for mediocrity. And I think it's the same thing for marriages. Not that my wife and I would ever see a real chance for us to split, because we've been married now for almost 29 years, coming up. Jesus Christ, coming up in about 3 or 4 days. I better get working.
Dude,
It's
get to it.
happening. I think it's
Yeah.
it's a
I hope
couple of
there's
days
no
from
more you
now.
have scheduled for after this, because I think you got to
I
run out to the store or
I
something,
got to
brother.
get some flowers quick.
Yeah.
It came up on me fast, but my point is that we constantly are working at the relationship to make it better, to keep those principles of trust, and seeing the highest and best in each other,
Yeah.
and to give each other feedback. People say, how do you possibly work with your wife in your business? And I said, well, she's not only my best friend and my business partner, but she's also my coach, and vice versa. It's all sort of part of the whole fluid thing. But does that mean that we would say we would never, ever, 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 ever split? Of course, that's a possibility. I don't
Yeah.
see that's possible. Yeah, it's not going to happen. But we've never ever said that's, to the same way that you would say we would never fire somebody. We
Yeah.
would never
Yeah.
say that we would never ever split. But in our gut, we know that wouldn't happen. But my
Yep.
point is, well, I've hopefully taken in that we sometimes have these sacred cows, and that we don't necessarily hold them accountable. And
Yeah.
that, I guess, what this ties back to with our previous conversation is that sometimes the relationship that you think is going to last forever, your buddy when you were in 16 doesn't.
Yeah.
Or the girlfriend or your wife or your husband or the person that helped you build your company, sometimes you have to take a different path, and that's okay.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
My latest acquisition, I mean, maybe we can bookend this part of the conversation this way, is, it was, she had reached out to me, it's like a month ago, or maybe like 4 months into this acquisition. And it was something about a customer had called her, and she's like, I haven't done it this way the entire 22 years I've been in business. And I'm like, well, I think that's probably the issue that you had.
Good. That's good. That's very good. Rick, this has really been a great chat. I wasn't quite sure where we were going to go when we started this,
We ended it with
but
laughs,
you
and you have to go get flowers.
exactly.
You know?
That's right, man. But it's more about just that I think that you're up to some really, obviously I appreciate the big bites you're taking out of life, and the lessons that you have learned and that you're teaching others about the ability to play big and to be mindful of the consequences of that.
Yeah.
And that, you when you see people sometimes, and I know a lot of them, you should probably too, who really think that big and really go after life in that way, you don't always see the self-awareness part. You see the driver, you see the ambitious person, you see the person who likes to build things, but you don't see a person who sort of sit back and contemplates their navel and figures out what all this means for them. It's all
Yeah.
about the pursuit, it's all about the kill, it's all about the next thing. For you, I can see this nice balance, this combination of a full person who's sort of aware of how all of this is happening from your business perspective, but also what's happening for you personally. And I think that's a breath of fresh air to see somebody like you go after life that way. So
Thank you, brother. Thank
yeah,
you.
that's awesome. So tell people how they can follow what you're all about.
Yeah, my biggest platforms that I'm active on the most are Instagram, which is at Mr. Rick Jordan, and then also on LinkedIn as well, which is the same thing, Mr. Rick Jordan. Please connect with me. I'm in my DMs all the time personally on these things. So I've got a great team behind me, but I love interacting and still engaging socially.
And you said you've got you do some coaching, you some connect with people, you work with organizations sometimes outside of your own company. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
specific. I mean, my program's called All In CEO. I mean that's the name of my show and everything. I mean, it's kind of the nature that I live life by. Because if you're going to do something, I just had it's a story, but yes, that's All In CEO. That's even the website is allinceo.com. I just had a new sales development rep at SDR, cold caller appointment setter, start on Monday, and she is the only Black female to be licensed by Jeep to sell products. The only one that exists. It's pretty awesome, right? So she's like, can I pick your brain on some business stuff? And I told her the same thing. I'm like, what I'm about to tell you will probably make you quit tomorrow. From here. So I'm laughing. I'm like, but you know what? She wants to grow it and everything. I'm like, then what are you doing here? Because the only way I believe that you can grow and actually go after what you really want is if you're all in with it. There's no fallback plan. There's no plan B. There might be a strategy to get there, but have those steps defined, to at least the next step anyways, not just that I'm just going to sit around and I'm going to wait for something to happen. In the meantime, that's going to be my side hustle. Cause I think a side hustle is a virus, dude, to entrepreneurship, so it's all in. That's what it's all about. That's what I teach people and try to help them realize too, in coaching them and helping them go to the next level in their life and their business.
Fantastic.
And I might lose an employee today. Who knows? Coach her for 30 minutes and she's like,
Rick, it's really been a pleasure to get to know you.
Same, Dean. Same.
Yeah. Thanks, bud.
Thank you for listening to Leadervation with Dean Newlund. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to learn more about Dean or Mission Facilitators Leadership, go to mfileadership.com. That's mfileadership.com, or check the show notes. Reimagine, facilitate, flourish. Transform your leadership success with Leadervation.